The basic contrast between the two, I suppose, is it summed up by the Spartan collective memory and belief that they are the descendants of conquerors. They are Dorian Greeks that have come from further north. They have overrun what becomes Sparta, then they add on Messenia in the 7th century. And they are conquerors. They rule because they have beaten the indigenous population who continue to exist as the Helot sort of serf class, for want of a better term. And that the Spartans rule because they deserve to, because they were stronger and they continue to be stronger and better at fighting, as opposed to an Athenian idea where they claim that they've sprung from the soil of Attica, that they've always been there. They are not conquerors. This is their land. It always has been. They belong to it. They've come from it.
Hello, I'm Zeb Links, editor at Aspects of History. In a warring world of thousands of city-states where honor, prestige, and survival were constantly at stake, two names would rise above the rest: Athens and Sparta. Though once allied together against the Persians, the powers would end up locked in a rivalry, the Peloponnesian War. In this episode of the podcast, Adrian Goldsworthy joins to discuss his latest book, Athens and Sparta, the rivalry that shaped ancient Greece. His stimulating account runs from mythic origins to the Peloponnesian War, exploring their contrasting identities and ideologies, militaristic Sparta as a conquering elite, and democratic Athens as an autochthonous society, and quite how these shape their politics and ambitions. Our conversation also considers the challenges of sources like Herodotus and Thucydides, the fragile alliances of the Persian Wars, and what descent into this enduring conflict reveals about power, warfare, and strategy. Joining me next week on the pod is Caelan Davenport, professor and historian, to probe the rumours and gossip, the oral world of imperial Rome that shaped the image of emperors as much as official power did. But for now, here's my discussion with Adrian Goldsworthy on Athens and Sparta.
Hello, Adrian. Great to have you on the Aspects of History podcast. Thanks so much for joining me.
That's right. Thanks for inviting me.
So we're here to discuss your new book, Athens and Sparta, the rivalry that shaped ancient Greece, which was released a couple of days ago by our mates at Head of Zeus. It's a thrilling and timely read in 3 acts, tracing the stories of the two leading powers, from the two city-states' mythological origins, Homer, all the way to the conclusion of the Peloponnesian War. It grapples with the complicated fallout from rivals to allies and an existential conflict with wider repercussions across the Eastern Mediterranean. So what exactly was the drive to tackle this mighty subject?
It really came from a book I wrote a few years ago about Philip II and Alexander the Great, father and son team, which obviously kicks off early part of the 4th century BC as Philip's born. And then what I wanted at the time, I kept looking around thinking, well, what I want is some book I can refer people to that gives you a sense of how the Greek world got to be where it was at that time. And I couldn't find one, the only ones that were out there were very, very elderly by now. There have been lots of discoveries since then that fundamentally change how we understand things. So it was partly that. And then it was the odd realization that while you get good books on, say, the Persian Wars, and that's one of the famous moments, or you get stuff on the Peloponnesian War, or there's always every year there's a book or two on Sparta and the peculiarities of Spartan society, many of which are great. It's just that no one was bringing it all together. So for somebody who's completely new to this period of history, I wanted to have something where you could pick the book up, read it, and you could get some sense of, well, what's happening in the world? Why are the Greek cities like this? Why are there so many cities? Why do the Greeks think that way? Why do they act that way? How do they behave? Where do all these little bits we've got, where do they fit? And what's the context for it all? So it's very much one book. This I see as a sort of prequel almost to that, although now it would make a good introduction to the other one. So it was, as someone who's obviously primarily a Romanist, that's where most of my work has been, you realize the importance of Greek history. And I think people have that sense that, the Greeks had all these great ideas. And, yes, the Spartans were very brave and this sort of thing. But the wider perception, you don't get as much attention to the Greeks in popular culture. There was that stuff a while back of supposedly some high proportion of men are thinking about the Roman Empire most of the time, or so many times a day in a week. And obviously, that's what I do for a living, so I do that. But you don't get the same thing with Greek history. You don't get that same sense. It tends to just look at isolated things. It looks at ideas. It looks at concepts of democracy, philosophy, the basis of science. It looks at just how the Spartans became so good at fighting, but no context, no sense of what this world was like. So that's what I've tried to give in this book.
Yeah, the chronology primarily focuses on political and military events between the two rivals, but it does include plenty of literary, philosophical, cultural insight that colours it. When we look at the Athenians and the Spartans, there's always that polarity of ideologies that's focused on. And how aware of those differences do you think the inhabitants and leadership of the two realms were? Or is that a kind of oversimplification of the relationship?
I mean, it is and it isn't. And obviously there are big differences, and the tendency of our sources, and particularly those on the Spartans that are almost entirely written by outsiders, is to focus on the peculiarities, the things that made the Spartans different. There's a lot that they have in common as well. They consider themselves to be Greeks. They speak, yes, different dialects of the language, but it's the same language. They both read Homer. They both have so many references to myths, to stories, to cults that are all in common, as they do with all the other Greek cities out there. I mean, that's the big thing that it's hard to explain to people, is you are talking about the Greeks before there is a Greece. There is no drive towards unity. In spite of all these cultural similarities, you've got, certainly by the early 4th century, there are over 1,000 city-states. Athens and Sparta happen to be a couple of the really big ones, but there's this vast number of fiercely independent communities out there. So that's the context of the world. It's not just that you have these two cities, you have this wider sense of who the Greeks are and what they're doing. And yes, there's a lot of war and politics, because that tends to be what the sources talk about, but also that's very much tied up with how they understand how these communities, how these city-states function. Famously, Herodotus will talk about the Athenians, and they become democratic and they become better at war making. And that's the only bit he really doesn't tell us terribly much about what they're actually doing politically and how the system has changed. But you have this lot in the sense that, suddenly the Athenians matter militarily in a way they haven't before, which is not quite the modern mindset. But then we need to understand, why are people at the time thinking like that? So the basic contrast between the two, I suppose, is it summed up by the Spartan collective memory and belief that they are the descendants of conquerors. They are Dorian Greeks that have come from further north. They have overrun what becomes Sparta, then they add on Messenia in the 7th century. And they are conquerors. They rule because they have beaten the indigenous population, who continue to exist as the Helot sort of serf class, for want of a better term. And that the Spartans rule because they deserve to, because they were stronger and they continue to be stronger and better at fighting, as opposed to an Athenian idea where they claim that they've sprung from the soil of Attica, that they've always been there. They are not conquerors. This is their land. It always has been. They belong to it. They've come from it. So those are quite different attitudes from the start. It then obviously develops. It's one of the reasons why the book tries to go back to look at the rise of each of these communities, is that we associate Athens so much with democracy, and yet in the later 7th into the 6th centuries BC, this is a time of attempts at tyranny by, we know of the one by Cylon. We've got the lawgivers like Draco, who's probably more famous today because people know the word draconian, even though they don't really know much of what he did. And in fact, we don't know a lot of what he actually did, only that he had this reputation for severity in his laws. You've got Solon, whom again you probably don't hear about unless you've studied it of ancient history. But the idea of, we've got a crisis, the state isn't working, people are fighting each other, we've not got stability, so let's get somebody to sort of reform the system, start us going again, give us these laws, give us a new constitution. You then lead on to the tyranny of Pisistratus and his sons. So Athens isn't always like the famous classical city of the 5th century that we if we know anything we know a little bit about, even though the Athenians then, they tend to see Solon as a precursor to the democracy, or part of the democracy, that good law makes for the rule of the demos, the people. So you have in Sparta an elite that see themselves as conquerors, or the descendants of conquerors. In Athens, you have a population that's sprung up from the soil and that is trying to, after the expulsion of the last tyrant, which occurs not through anything the Athenians do, but through Spartan military intervention, though it doesn't quite go as the Spartans planned afterwards, you end up with this revolution associated with Cleisthenes, where you create a political system that pushes the idea of who will participate in making decisions in public life and how often, to an extreme that's never really been matched anywhere else, to be honest, in terms of the directness of the democracy.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the Homeric kind of. I mean, you begin the book with the opening lines, and I guess that's testament to the scope. And you kind of demonstrate very compellingly how key it is to understanding what came before to what will happen. So you'd say that these two examples, Sparta and Athens, are both organic developments of all of those archaic Greek characteristics. And despite that, they end up two very different sides of the coin, I suppose.
Yes, I think it has this sense, because you could argue that the Spartans are trying to live the life of one of the heroes of the Iliad, in the sense, and there's even the peculiarity that Spartans keep having longer hairstyles, longer than everybody else. That's very much an archaic thing. You have all those statues of youths, of men with long hair. It's the Spartans who keep that style for full adults, though they do rather peculiar things with shaving off moustaches and having beards and this sort of thing. But it's, in a sense, having your helots allows you to concentrate on doing the heroic things. And we focus very much on the military. That's our natural thing. Oh, yes, the great soldiers. Partly because, it's not an exaggeration to say that nearly everybody's image of Sparta is a lot to Thermopylae, and a simplified version of that, of the 300 who hold the pass and then die to the last man. But you're really being a professional citizen. You're a full-time, you're involved in the state, you're involved in the community. You spend an awful lot of time with other Spartans. And the whole emphasis on you don't fight each other, you joke about each other, but there are limits to it. You don't carry a stick to public meetings so you don't hit anybody. But you are, in a sense, you're living a version of the ideal of Homer, or the ideal of many of the characters within Homer. And part of that is that, well, you matter, your opinion matters, you should be listened to, because you fight in a way that is dangerous, and you fight better and more bravely than everyone else. Therefore, it's that sort of sense of inherent worth, which extends to the whole personal appearance, physical fitness, that sense of, the one thing that you feel runs right the way through is this sense that you want to excel. That's a very, very Greek thing, particularly for a man who considers himself a man who matters within society. But to excel, you need an audience. And it's, it isn't a coincidence that we have the Olympic Games in their revived form. And that's one of the few things most people remember about the Greeks. It isn't just enough to win. You have to have people cheering you and basically saying, yes, admitting, yes, you've won, you are the best. So there's that element that runs into the Athenian way. They develop it in a different way. But again, the sense that being a citizen of Athens puts you apart from everybody else in the world. Not just the barbarians out there, but other Greeks, because you could look at Pericles' funeral oration, the version given in Thucydides. It's basically saying how great we are. We deserve to succeed, and we do it in a way that's better than the Spartans, that is more traditional in some ways, but it's more proper. This is the right way to do that. So there's that sense. It is no coincidence that people will invoke Homer, they'll quote Homer, they'll refer to Homer, and you see this right the way through into the Roman period in Greco-Roman culture. And when you think centuries later, somebody like Cicero can quote Homer as a guide to, well, this is how I should behave in public life, and this is something I should do, and this matters. It has a deep, deep influence on everybody, and that much closer to the time when it is we tend to emphasize as historians, we go and look at the Iliad, the Odyssey, and we're trying to say, well, we're trying to understand archaic Greek culture, society, and then, of course, you get into all sorts of problems about what's being described, what's exaggerated, what isn't. But there is a sense of this could be read by a Spartan or an Athenian. They could both feel inspired by it and both identify with aspects of it, even though it's not exactly the same to life in their current day and age.
Yeah, I mean, so that kind of pan-Hellenic feel, I mean, at the time of the Persian invasions, Marathon in 490 and the battles in 481, 480, how remarkable was it that any of these thousands of Greek states managed to hold an alliance, let alone the two major rivals? Is it an outlier moment, a kind of historical exception to what came before and what would then follow?
I mean, there's an element you could argue that obviously you have the revolt of the Ionian Greek cities that prompts the intervention of the Athenians and others into supporting that rebellion that brings them into the sort of the more direct notice of the Persians. And they can collaborate. You do have one of the big problems is that really, because Herodotus is inspired by the Persian Wars to start writing about Greek history, although we know there are other lost sources from earlier, there is that sense of trying to understand the political history of what's gone before is incredibly difficult in that period. But the impression is that while you do have alliances, they're much smaller scale. The whole nature of the Persian intervention is that this is something different. This is, again, we forget that the Persian Empire is a relatively new creation. Cyrus is operating in the 560s, the middle of the 6th century. And then it's only 490 when you get, as you said, the Marathon campaign and the first invasion. But it is odd, and because, the thing that strikes us, even though the Spartans, between those two, the Athenians and Spartans and Plataeans and some of the people on Euboea agree to levels of cooperation, though in fact the Spartans aren't there for Marathon. It's only Athenians and Plataeans who actually fight and win that battle in 490. But by the time of the much bigger preparations that are consciously on the part of the great King Xerxes, they are made spectacular and grand to intimidate. I am coming back. I'm leading a much bigger army and fleet, and I'm going to sort out these Greeks that have caused me problems. Again, the striking thing is the overwhelming majority of Greek communities submit to the Persians or at least try and remain neutral. The Spartans issue this appeal a year or two before, trying to form this grand alliance, which works to some extent, but you have people like the Thessalians who will agree, and early on in the conflict, Greek army, a confederation of these allies, send an army north, but the Persians haven't got there and are a month or so away, and also they realize that the position isn't one they can hold. It can easily be outflanked. So they go back, and when Persians do arrive, the Thessalians pretty much submit to the Persians. Later on, after Thermopylae, Thebes and other cities in the area will change sides. So you have just over 30 states are considered to stay true to the cause and fight to the very end. So there are probably almost as many Greeks with the Persian army and navy as there are fighting against them for much of the time, in the broader sense. So it is one of those oddities, but it is the great moment. And you feel there's an impression in the sources that the Spartans and others, the Spartans perhaps in particular because they're the leaders of this alliance, feel that something different has happened. And you have, there's the famous story about Themistocles distracting the Spartans while the Athenians rebuild their city walls in the aftermath, after Salamis and after Plataea and the defeat of the Persian invasion, that there'd been this agreement beforehand. Not only did the Greeks stop fighting wars against each other so that they can combine their resources to oppose the big threat of Persia, but also that we're not going to do it in the future. So there are probably people with very bright-eyed ideas thinking, well, we can do something different. We don't have to be fighting each other. And of course, you'll later on, though it takes a while to develop, you will have the Panhellenists who will eventually lead up to Philip II and Alexander talking about we shouldn't be fighting each other. We should join together to fight the barbarians. Then we could live as proper Greeks off the spoils and the labor force of Asia. So it is that I think there's an idea of something different, but the problem is when you think even the accounts of particularly the build up to Salamis, but then again afterwards, are filled with bickering between the Greek states. The sense of where should we fight, where do we stop the Persians, who gets sacrificed, whose territory gets sacrificed. All of the competition for distinction, for honor, famously after the Battle of Salamis, the big naval fight, which has been engineered by the Athenian admiral Themistocles. And, the Athenians provide over half, almost 2/3 of the entire Greek fleet in that battle. At the end, everybody votes to say who has contributed most to the victory. Themistocles wins because everybody's voted for themselves first and him second. There's still this sense that in all of this, yes, cooperation's all very well, but I really want to be on top. I want to be the most distinguished, the most honored, the most praised. And I want, again, it's this desire for an audience that everyone's admitting that. It isn't enough just to be good and just to be capable and just to be successful. People have to acknowledge it and reflect it back to you.
And it's 50 years between the Allies' victory over the Persians and then the start of the Peloponnesian War in 431. You discuss the difficulty of piecing together the events and the ups and downs that lead to the conflict, the lack of sources, the challenges faced by the Spartans and the rise of Athenian imperialism. But can you put a unifying reason for the breakdown of relations, or was this an inevitable consequence?
I mean, I'm tempted to jump centuries forward and go Roman again and quote the poet Lucan about the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey, is that at root it's because Caesar wouldn't accept a superior and Pompey won't accept an equal. An awful lot of it comes down to prestige. I mean, part of it is they've never done this before and everything is new. And Athens, again, we tend to forget how quick the rise of Athens was. Even there's always a tendency with scholars, we look back and we look at a date and we say, 10 years, well, that's not very long. In our own lives, that is a long period of time. But when you think it's only in the later 480s that the Athenians vote public money from the silver mines at Lorient to build the fleet, to create this fleet of 200 triremes, that Athens goes from being a big city but not that important a city to suddenly one that's beaten the Persians at Marathon largely on its own with just Plataean help, and then has a bigger fleet than anybody else. And not just anybody else, but as I say, the Athenians have the majority of ships at Salamis. So basically Athenian naval power is pretty much as big or bigger than that of all the other Greek states put together. And that's just happened in a few years. And then there's a question of, well, what do you do now? And because we think of the Persian War stopping with the victories in 479 BC, Plataea, the big one on land, of course the Persians are still there. And we know with hindsight the Persians are never coming back. There will never be another serious attempt at a Persian invasion. But people at the time don't know that. So it dominates them for quite a long time. And because things are going to be conducted in the Aegean, and because the Spartans do have this ability to be startlingly tactless when they're put in charge and when they're trying to lead a coalition of other Greeks. Particularly, again, there's this, it's the old cliche of the further a Spartan leader gets away from Sparta, the less well he behaves. They've alienated people, but the Athenians take over. But there then becomes this thing: how does Sparta see them? Sparta is the much older state in terms of prestige. It's been acknowledged as the greatest military power in Greece because it's the one that sends out the call, forms the alliance that's opposed the Persians. But now it can't really continue the struggle, and the Athenians can. The Athenians have suddenly become bigger and stronger and want to be accepted as, one suspects at the very least, the equal of Sparta. Different because they're a sea power, but nevertheless, they are a formidable sea power. They have made victory possible, and they make the continued resistance against the Persians possible. So Athens wants that recognition, and the Spartans feel that that will diminish them. As far as they're concerned, there really needs to be one state, one group of people, one group of citizens who are the best, the most militarily important, the most worthy. Again, coming back to that very Homeric sense of how you are considered by others. And even in Homer, and this is reflected again in Greek history and more widely in the ancient world, how strong you are perceived to be does directly affect how people treat you. And if they feel you are vulnerable, then they do tend to pick fights with you. They do tend to treat you in a different way. So while you're talking about prestige, honor, these concepts, they have a very tangible, a very practical consequence in how your state actually is able to conduct its affairs, in how other people treat you, and whether or not they're aggressive towards you, whether they will do what you ask them to, whether they will treat you with respect, whether they will attack you. So it all comes from that. And while there is an increasingly clear difference between the way Athens works and the Spartans work, and again, it comes back to sources. We would love to know more when there are this series of earthquakes that devastate much of the Peloponnese, but particularly the Spartan homeland, that leads to a rebellion by a lot of the Helot community and some of the allied community as well. The Spartans ask for help from other Greek states, the allies with whom they'd stood shoulder to shoulder against Persia. And the Plataeans, for instance, will later on, again, largely through coincidence, sources tell us, send an awful lot of their hoplites, an awful lot of their soldiers to go and help the Spartans quell this rebellion. The Athenians send, at least at one point, a major army. There may be more than one intervention. And then the Spartans are supposed to request their aid and then send them home after a relatively short period of time. And we don't really know quite what this dispute sprang from. It seems to be something about the behavior of the Athenians, whether it's the way they treated the Spartans, whether it's the way the Spartans treated them. But it's a deep humiliation. Everybody else is told to stay, but the Athenians to go home. So it isn't necessarily inevitable that they would become enemies, but this constant rivalry to be on top, this constant sense that everyone is looking around and ranking all the states within the Greek world, all the cities. And they are also, within those cities, they tend to be ranking individuals for prestige as well. So it's competition is going on everywhere all the time. And it never ends because, yes, you may have been less impressive last year, but you might have improved things now. You might have done something that demands more attention or, in turn, diminishes your reputation. So there's a direct link between this competition to excel, to be acknowledged as the best, for prestige, with the practical things. And yes, the big major war begins in 431, but you have Athenians and Spartans clash in battle before that in the 450s. And that's the odd thing, is that when you do get to the Peloponnesian War, there is never a pitched battle on any scale on land where Athenians and Spartans clash. And it's a war that to a great extent is fought by proxies or against proxies of either side. So it ends up including so many other people who get caught up in this struggle because of these two big cities that are arguing and bickering for power and prestige.
Hello, Zeb here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben McIntyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Yeah, I'm glad you kind of pointed that out, because I think it does stand as this ideological rivalry, and so many people kind of like to draw out the comparisons to geopolitics today, both in terms of Athenian imperialism and then this kind of struggle between two utterly polarized states. But yeah, talk us through what can be learned or gained from this kind of conflict for politicians today. I mean, obviously there's quite a lot going on the world stage as we speak.
Well, it's no coincidence that Thucydides is still often consulted, often read amongst the sort of academic strategic studies and policymakers today, because, I mean, the odd thing is about all of this is that it's such small scale. And these are communities that are very close together. When you think the Spartans who turn up too late for marathon, there's supposed to be 2,000 of them, get from Sparta to Athens in 3 days on their 2 feet. Now these are exceptionally fit, picked troops that are hastening, but these are really not very far apart. And yet you can see so many aspects of politics, of strategy within the way they relate to each other. A lot is different. Things mattered in the ancient world that don't matter to quite the same extent today. But you have that essential problem is that I think perhaps, especially post-Cold War in the West, we got very complacent and thought, well, that's over, everything can be nice now. And that we will remain not only successful and on top and deserving to be, but that everybody else will just become more and more like us. And yet the Greek lesson is that actually everyone is looking at everyone else, and everyone is readjusting their sense of where they fit into this picture, where their place is in the pecking order. And you obviously don't want to be on the bottom then or today, to be quite honest, because even if we see ourselves as entirely enlightened and peaceful, we'd still like to go to other cultures and say, well, this is how we think we could help you. This is how we can improve education. This is how we can improve agriculture, energy generation, these sorts of things. We often have a very self-satisfied view that our own way is best. And you can argue in individual cases whether or not that's necessarily justified. But within this context, I mean, there's an interesting thing is that obviously in the ancient world, states go to war with far less reluctance than would be the case in the modern world. And they don't need much in the way of provocation. They all like to pretend that what they're doing is justified, though again, you'll get in Thucydides the descriptions of the Athenians basically saying, well, we can do this, so we're going to do it. We want to, we've got the power. There is a basic truth in Athenian, I was going to say military, but it's primarily naval power, but that extends its military capacity. And it comes back to this creation of a fleet of the most modern warships of the day. These are triremes, these are oared galleys that require very large crews for their size. You're talking about 200 or so for each ship, and the Athenians at Salamis have got 200 of those ships. So it requires vast numbers of people. There's probably never more than about 40,000 or so Athenian citizens, and yet they have this fleet that requires almost that many people to crew it. Now, clearly they're hiring lots of others, and as the Athenians create this system of allies, which we call the Delian League, and then we call it the Athenian Empire, you've got an awful lot of hired rowers, and there is this debate from the start of the war about whether or not the Spartans or anybody else can outbid us and hire the rowers that we rely upon. And in a sense, the Spartans were able to do that with Persian gold in the last stages of the war. But creating that fleet is something that gives you immense power, but to maintain it is staggeringly expensive. It not only needs all those people, it needs lots of money because these ships decay, they have to be replaced, they have to be repaired, they have to be equipped. And if they're going to be any good, if they're not going to be just some great lump of timber, then you have to practice in them. And you have to go to sea. You can't fake this. So the Athenians create a system whereby a lot of resources, partly drawn from their allies, are devoted to maintaining this naval supremacy. And the thing is, once you've got that, can you afford to backpedal, to not do this anymore, to not do the training, to not do the logistical support, to not have the bases, and also, will you only be respected as long as it occasionally does go off and do something violent to someone or forces them to submit through threat of violence? So there is always the problem with power is that, again, it comes back in a sense to this Greek idea that you're only really powerful if other people believe you are. And there is still so much bluster in modern diplomacy and international relations that then can come a cropper when you actually have to fight a war, because that tends to be more difficult. But there's that element, it's the balancing act between presenting an image to the world that I am very strong and therefore it'd be a good idea for you if, you do what I like or what I ask you to do. And generally speaking, I'll be a nice person and I'll only ask you to do nice things. But then the crunch point comes when you actually have to prove that you are worthy of respect, you are worthy of fear even, or you are worthy of friendship, that you're a good ally, people are better off if they're friendly towards you, well disposed towards you, generally well inclined. So many of the principles of the use of power are already there plain to see in this period. But the other reminder is that nothing is permanent. Again, 20 years' time, we don't know what sort of situation we're going to be dealing with in terms of world power, where the balance will be. You can have, another curious thing, really, we don't entirely know the origins of the trireme in any detail. There suddenly seem to be a lot of them around from about 500 BC. And then the Athenians go and they buy into this in a big way. But it's almost an element which might seem odd at first sight, but there's that technological element with the modern world, that things come along in the same way that militaries throughout the world and navies are struggling to cope with the full implications of the development of drones and drone warfare. And they don't quite know how that's going to influence other things, what's going to be the best way to do it, what the counters will be. These things can happen very suddenly and throw the balance out, which means that even the great power that has become so formidable in one particular way, if something else comes along, or if there is a different requirement, if you're asked to do something else. So it's the unpredictability of the future that I think the Greeks should remind us of. When you think both sides go into the Peloponnesian War in 431 pretty confidently and with very little reluctance, but without a clear idea of how to win. They've both got strategies that essentially are there to, well, we'll outlast the other and they'll eventually give in. But there isn't a way of physically beating them, partly because one's a naval power and one's a land power. But there is just that sense of, well, we're strong, we'll prove we're strong, and it'll be all right in the long run. So it's a reminder of how things can develop way beyond the expectations, let alone control, of the major players, and then come to be influenced by all sorts of, the others are involved as well. The smaller players, yes, this is a book mainly about Athens and Sparta, but other cities play critical roles, and other communities who may be much smaller make a huge difference. And they're not just pro-Spartan or anti-Spartan or pro-Athenian, anti-Athenian or Persian or whatever it might be. Other peoples have their own ambitions, their own particular unique agendas that they're trying to pursue.
Quite the analysis, I'd say, and it does ring true and rhyme. So much of what we know about both the kind of major conflicts you discuss in the book hinge on Herodotus and Thucydides, respectively. And the two pillars of Western historiography. It goes without saying that you must have become as well acquainted with both of them as one will ever be in writing a book like this. But talk us through the research process and presumably the different ways in which you had to approach both authors as sources.
Yes, I try to adopt the same basic principles when I'm working on anything from the ancient world. So this was nice because this is a period I've taught courses on this years and years ago when I was a junior academic and this sort of thing, but I haven't looked at this era in so much detail in the broader sense for a long time. So it was great fun to come and do it. The one thing I have always found with any ancient source is that no matter how many times you read it, when you reread it, you always see something new. Something seems to jump out at you, strangely enough, that you've never noticed before. Or it's probably because of the ways you've started to think, but also the incredible level of detail that's often tucked away in passages about something else. So obviously you're coming from that point of view. There is such a vast wealth of scholarship on both, as much, if not more, than any of the great historians for the ancient world. But you come to that same basic problem. We know that they are not writing history in the modern sense, although in some ways Thucydides can feel closer. There is such that marked difference between Herodotus, who chucks in lots of good stories because they're good stories, who is filled with omens and dreams and Delphic oracles and all sorts of things, to Thucydides, who is apparently much more sober, but also frustratingly lacking in detail of so many things. So often he doesn't tell us numbers. He doesn't tell us precise timings. He doesn't give us, how big is this army? How big is this fleet? The sort of basics that you'd want to know. He's very vague about that period between the Persian War and the 431. He really kicks off with 431 in terms of detailed narrative, and then, of course, doesn't complete the book. So I think you've got to take it as it stands, say that each one, you do try to understand, well, who they are, what was their capacity to know about the things they're talking about at that very basic level. So Thucydides was an eyewitness for some of them, was an Athenian, was involved in the conflict until his exile, whereas Herodotus talks about talking to people who'd been there, but otherwise listening to stories. That's obviously a different perspective, but there is always this basic problem that while you have some later material that covers some of the same period, and obviously you've got all the anecdotes in Plutarch and this thing, but so much of the later stuff is much, much later. You're getting into the Roman era when this is written centuries later. And of course, that's even more of a problem when you deal with Alexander the Great and Philip, where it's all so much later, virtually everything. You have the advantage that these are people who, in Herodotus' case, were familiar with these societies within at least a generation of many of the events he describes, the more recent ones. Thucydides, who is a participant, is there for much of the time, followed on by Xenophon, who contributes to that end piece. The one basic problem we have is that we can often say, well, there might be reasons why they would depict the Athenians doing this, the Spartans doing this, why Thucydides is not going to portray somebody like Cleon whom he can't stand in a good light. The basic problem is with all of ancient history, if you reject what the evidence they give us, there is usually nothing else to put in its place. And the idea of saying, well, I think this is just inherently more likely to have happened is fine, but is incredibly subjective. So it's always about trying to weigh what they're saying, how plausible does it sound, how does it fit with how we understand society at that time, although the practical elements, if they say, this person moves from this place to that place in that time, would that be possible? What is the landscape topography of this area like? How does this marry up with what they're telling us? Does it seem to make sense? On the whole, for all their flaws, particularly the imaginative joy in a good story that you feel Herodotus takes, and while it's tempting to say that he sees through and doesn't really believe this stuff, well, again, that's very subjective. Judging that, we've got to accept them, or at least we've got to say, well, this is what they say, and based on this seems to be the most likely reconstruction. But one thing that I think is fundamental to studying, let alone writing about ancient history, is admitting again and again that often we can't prove it. We do not know, or there are severe gaps. The chronology of the period, even though Thucydides tells us some things about this, between Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War is abysmal. There are so many events that we have an idea roughly when they happened, but it can be a decade or so. The expedition to support a rebellion against the Persians in Egypt that the Athenians send a significant fleet to and then suffer a serious loss in, that many would compare to the defeat of Syracuse during the Peloponnesian War. The evidence for that's abysmal, and we really don't know the scale of all of this. So you've got to keep admitting we don't know things. We are guessing. This is the evidence. This is our best guess. And obviously it's my book, so it's going to be my best guess, but I'm trying to make clear where I am uncertain, where there are doubts, the degree to which this is based on, well, this is, to me, the most plausible reading of these sources. You can't keep doing that in every sentence, but you've got to make it clear that that's really what you are doing overall.
Well, doubts, guesses, gaps aside, I think it's a very coherent account, and I've really enjoyed it. What's next for you in terms of projects or titles? Are you planning to stick with Greece or head back to Rome?
I'm doing something on ancient warfare, and which is partly back to my roots, because obviously I've done a lot of military stuff, and then my thesis was on the Roman army. all those years ago. I mean, I was rather shocked to realize the book on which it's based came out 30 years ago this year. So, but I'd like to go from the origins of war. I'm not quite sure. I haven't yet. I'm still in the research stage where I'm going to stop. Obviously, the Greco-Roman period will be the heart of it because the sources become better. But I'd like to try and one thing that keeps jumping out to me again and again when I do books like the Athens and Sparta is there's a tendency for traditional military history to focus on armies and particularly battles and commanders. And battles are important. I think Churchill talked about the sort of the punctuation of history. They can make a difference, but they're also surprisingly rare. And there is far more warfare that is much lower scale and has far more to do with raiding. Go in, do unpleasant things to the enemy or steal things from the enemy and then go away again. So that actually, I think we might be looking at warfare completely wrong. We're looking at the unusual and making that typical. And that when you look at the societies and how they develop and what they're trying to do, it's actually something rather different, and trying to understand that better and just what's going on, along with obviously the armies and the battles and the commanders will all be there as well. But it comes from some work I've done on the Roman period, non-Roman frontiers and Hadrian's Wall, and trying to say it's all very well talking about in strategic studies terms, you've got sort of low-intensity warfare and high-intensity warfare, but actually they're not separate. They're related to each other. Again, the prime example from this book, if you look at the Peloponnesian War, big battles are not a feature of this. There are only really 2 big land battles within that broader period. Possibly it includes some of the fighting around Syracuse within that, but it's nowhere near a battle a year. So it's almost not really a battle every decade. The naval battles only really kick off in the later part of the war when the Spartans start getting Persian funding, and yet people are fighting and dying every year. And Thucydides' accounts and the supporting ones are filled with these incredibly brutal, smaller scale actions. So it's coming back to what actually is the importance of sieges. How do the defenses work and what are you defending yourself against? So trying to put in a broader context, going back to as early as we can, how have human beings, how have different societies and cultures interacted violently with each other, but also alongside that, when are they peaceful? When does it work? What is war for? What's it meant to achieve? And how does that influence the development? Why is it that in both the Iliad and the Odyssey and Homer, the Basileus class, the characters like Odysseus, like Achilles, why are they so important? Why do societies feel they need them? And what do they do? And how does that influence the political side? So it's trying to be a practical look at, well, how did warfare actually work? What was going on? How do the weapons work? How do the human beings function within this? Again, this will be a book of asking an awful lot of questions, many of which I will not be able to answer with saying, well, this is 100% certain, this is what happened. But I hope it'll be enlightening, not simply for those interested in military history, but in a sense of how we understand the past and the ancient world and what we mean, conflict and what we mean by peace, what we mean by war, these sorts of things. So that's the theme at the moment. I'm still very much in the research stage of that one. So it'll be another couple of years before it's out.
Great stuff. Well, thanks so much, Adrian. Had we more time, there's so much more to draw out of a book like this. So Athens and Sparta, the rivalry that shaped ancient Greece, is published in hardback by Head of Zeus. We'll put the links in the description. So do have a browse. Don't miss Adrian's contribution in our April magazine, which is out now, and a review of the book. So great to have you on and look forward to the next time.
Marvelous. Thanks very much for having me. It's been great fun.
Thanks so much for listening. Links are in the show notes. Please share with friends and family and keep your eyes peeled for new episodes. And if you want to get in touch, you can through X or email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.